1 in 3 Americans skipped a meal in the past year because they could not afford to eat. That is not a number from the developing world. That is not a number from a failed state. That is a number from the United States of America, published by the Century Foundation in December 2025, and it is up from 1 in 4 just months earlier. The trajectory is accelerating, and the USDA's own Household Food Security Report released on December 31, 2025, revealed that 47.9 million Americans lived in food-insecure households in 2024. That is an increase from 47.4 million the year before, and 13.5 million more than in 2021. And 14.1 million of those 47.9 million are children. Children in the wealthiest country in the history of civilization who do not have reliable access to enough food to eat. And what makes the summer of 2026 different from any summer in recent memory is that the forces driving hunger in America are not easing. They are compounding. The SNAP program that feeds 40 million Americans is being cut by $295 billion over the next decade, the largest reduction in the program's history. The Iran war has disrupted global fertilizer supply chains, with the World Bank documenting a 46% surge in urea fertilizer prices between February and March 2026 alone. The government shutdown disrupted SNAP payments in at least 25 states. Food prices have risen 36% since 2014, and the Trump administration just announced that it will no longer publish the USDA Household Food Security Report, the only comprehensive federal survey that tracks hunger in America, eliminating the tool that would have measured the damage. They are cutting the food, and then they are destroying the instrument that measures the hunger. And the summer is when all of it converges, because summer is when 30 million children who rely on free and reduced-price school lunches lose access to those meals for 10 to 12 weeks. And the families who were barely holding on during the school year are about to discover what happens when the last reliable meal their children receive disappears from the schedule. 47.9 million Americans are already food insecure, and the number has been climbing for 4 straight years. The USDA's December 2025 report documented that food insecurity in the United States has been rising continuously since 2021. In 2021, 34.4 million people lived in food-insecure households. By 2022, that number climbed to 44.2 million. By 2023, it reached 47.4 million. And by 2024, it hit 47.9 million. 4 consecutive years of increasing hunger in the richest country on earth. 1 in 7 American households, 13.7%, experienced food insecurity in 2024. Among households with children, the rate was 18.4%, nearly 1 in 5 families with kids. Among single-parent households headed by women, the rate was 36.8%, more than 1 in 3. Among Black households, 24.4%. Among Latino households, 20.2%. And among older Americans aged 65 and over, food insecurity rose to 11% in 2024, up from 10% the previous year, meaning more than 1 million additional senior citizens experienced food insecurity compared to the year before. These are people on fixed incomes, people who have already retired, people who cannot go find a second job to cover the gap between their Social Security check and their grocery bill. And the data on very low food security, which is the most extreme category where people actually had to cut down on meals or go without eating entirely because they could not afford food, rose to 5.3%, up from 5.1% in 2023. That is 18 million Americans who experienced periods of actual hunger. Not just anxiety about food, but the physical experience of not eating because there was nothing to eat or no money to buy it. And over 50 million Americans turned to food banks and pantries for help, according to Feeding America. 50 million, in a country that produces more food per capita than almost any nation on earth. The problem is not production. The problem is that the food exists and the people who need it cannot afford to buy it. And the cost of the food they cannot afford to buy just got dramatically more expensive because of a war 6,000 miles away that disrupted the fertilizer supply chain that determines the cost of growing everything Americans eat. The Iran war just blew up the fertilizer supply chain, and the price increase has not reached your grocery store yet. The World Bank's Food Security Update, published 2 weeks ago, documented that urea fertilizer prices surged by nearly 46% month over month between February and March 2026 amid the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. 46% in 1 month. Urea is the most widely used nitrogen fertilizer on Earth. It is the chemical foundation of modern industrial agriculture. Without it, crop yields drop by 30 to 50% depending on the crop and the soil, and the Strait of Hormuz crisis has disrupted the supply chains that deliver both the natural gas used to produce urea and the shipping routes used to transport it. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization warned that the risks from the current conflict, including energy price shocks and trade route disruptions, are setting the stage for sharper price increases in the months ahead. The World Food Program estimated that the conflict could potentially push 45 million additional people into acute hunger globally by mid-2026. And the fertilizer price increase that happened in March has not yet reached the American consumer's grocery receipt. Fertilizer prices affect the cost of planting, which happens in spring. The crops planted with more expensive fertilizer will be harvested in late summer and fall. The cost of those more expensive crops will be processed, packaged, and distributed to grocery stores in late fall and winter. But the futures markets have already priced in the increase, which means the wholesale food companies that buy commodity crops in advance are already paying more. And those costs will be passed to retail over the next 4 to 6 months. The March CPI already showed food prices climbing. Grocery store food rose 0.5% in March alone. Coffee was up 19% year over year. Beef was up 19% year over year. Beef was up 15%. Eggs remain more than double their 2019 baseline in most markets because of the avian influenza outbreak that has culled over 185 million birds since 2022. And the second-order effects of the Iran war energy shock, the diesel that powers every truck, every tractor, every refrigerated warehouse, every processing plant in the American food system, are currently propagating through the supply chain on a 60 to 120-day lag. The food price increases that Americans will experience this summer are already locked in by the energy and fertilizer cost increases that happened in March. The war may end tomorrow. The grocery bill will not come down for months. And the structural vulnerability that the war exposed goes beyond the immediate price shock. The global food system depends on a fertilizer supply chain that runs through the most geopolitically unstable region on Earth. Russia and Belarus, which were already under sanctions that disrupted fertilizer trade after the 2022 Ukraine invasion, account for approximately 40% of global potash exports. The Middle East, now in active conflict, is a major producer of both urea and ammonia. And the shipping routes that connect fertilizer production to agricultural consumption, the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, the Suez Canal, are all either blocked, contested, or operating under wartime insurance premiums that have increased the cost of transit by multiples. The redundancy in the global fertilizer supply chain is zero. There is no alternative supplier that can replace 46% of urea supply in a matter of months. There is no strategic fertilizer reserve maintained by any government analogous to the strategic petroleum reserve for oil. When fertilizer prices spike, farmers face an impossible choice: apply less fertilizer and accept lower yields, which means less food produced. Or apply the same amount at 46% higher cost and pass that cost to the consumer, which means more expensive food for families that are already spending more than they can afford. Either way, the American food supply gets worse this summer. Less food or more expensive food. There is no third option. SNAP is being gutted, and the government just eliminated the only tool that measures how many Americans go hungry. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act cut $295 billion in federal SNAP funding over the next decade, a 36% reduction by 2034, according to the Commonwealth Fund. That is the largest cut in the history of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Benefits will be cut by approximately $100 per month for roughly 600,000 low-income households. Work requirements are being expanded to include adults aged 55 to 64 for the first time. The standard utility allowances that simplified eligibility determinations are being eliminated, creating new paperwork barriers that will cause eligible people to lose benefits through bureaucratic failure rather than ineligibility. And starting in fiscal year 2027, which begins October 1, 2026, States' share of SNAP administrative costs increases from 50% to 75%, a 50% increase in the administrative burden that states must absorb. States that cannot absorb the increase will have to reduce SNAP eligibility or cut other programs to fund the difference. And then the USDA announced that it will no longer publish the Household Food Security Report, the annual survey that has been the gold standard for measuring hunger in America for nearly 30 years. CSIS published an analysis noting that the report, which uses data from the Census Bureau's current population survey reaching approximately 60,000 households per month, is the most comprehensive tool available for nationally representative and state-level estimates of food insecurity. No other survey can replace it. The USDA's stated justification was that the report is redundant and extraneous. CLASP responded that eliminating this annual data will not end food insecurity, it will only hide the struggle that millions of families face to put food on the table. CSIS analysts noted that the administration may have wanted to avoid culpability for a continued rise in food insecurity, particularly as the SNAP cuts enacted in the OBBBA take effect and are estimated to eliminate SNAP assistance for millions of Americans. The timing is not coincidental. The government is cutting the program that prevents hunger. And then the government is eliminating the report that would have documented the increase in hunger caused by those cuts. In the absence of the USDA report, there will be no authoritative, nationally representative federal data on how many Americans are food insecure in 2025, 2026, or any year thereafter. The 47.9 million number from December 2025 may be the last official count of hungry Americans that the federal government ever publishes. And the number was already climbing before the cuts. After the cuts, with no federal measurement, the hunger will be invisible. Not absent, invisible. People will still go hungry. The data just will not exist to prove it. And when the data does not exist, the political pressure to act on it disappears. That is not an accident. That is a strategy. And the USDA has also moved to restrict what SNAP recipients can purchase with their benefits. In March 2026, FRAC supported a lawsuit against the USDA to stop SNAP waivers that restrict food choice for participants. The restrictions dictate which items families can and cannot buy with their benefits, adding a layer of government control over the most intimate decision a family makes, what to feed their children. And in March 2026, FRAC urged representatives to reject the House Agriculture Committee Farm Bill, which passed 34-17 and contained further SNAP funding reductions on top of the OBBBA cuts. The Farm Bill cuts would compound the reconciliation cuts, meaning SNAP is being attacked from two legislative vehicles simultaneously. The reconciliation bill cut $295 billion. The Farm Bill proposes additional reductions. The USDA is restricting what can be purchased, and the federal food security measurement is being eliminated. Each of these actions individually would be concerning. Together, they constitute a systematic dismantling of the federal commitment to ensuring that Americans can afford to eat. And the Bipartisan Food Assurance and Security Act, introduced in late 2025 to protect the annual food security survey, has not been passed. Congress has been aware of the threat to the report for months. The bill exists. The votes have not been held, and every month of delay is a month closer to the permanent loss of the only data that tells the country how many of its citizens are going hungry. Summer is when 30 million children lose their only reliable meal, and food banks are already running out. During the school year, the National School Lunch Program provides free or reduced-price meals to approximately 30 million children every school day. For many of those children, the school lunch is the most nutritious and sometimes the only reliable meal they receive in a day. When school ends in June, those meals stop. The summer meal gap is one of the most well-documented phenomena in child nutrition research, and it is the reason that child food insecurity rates spike every summer. FRAC's April 1, 2026 report documented a significant increase in children participating in summer nutrition programs in 2024 compared to the previous summer. But participation rates in summer meal programs historically reach only a fraction of the children who receive meals during the school year. In a typical summer, for every 100 children who eat free lunch during the school year, only about 15 to 20 participate in a summer feeding program. The remaining 80 go without that meal entirely. Their families absorb the cost, or the children eat less, or they eat cheaper, less nutritious food, or they do not eat during the hours when they would have been eating at school. And the summer of 2026 will be the first summer after the SNAP cuts take effect. The families who were using SNAP to supplement the school lunch program during the school year, buying groceries that covered breakfast and dinner while the school covered lunch, will now have $100 less per month in SNAP benefits, and they will simultaneously lose the school lunch. The combined loss of SNAP dollars and school meals hits the same families in the same month at the same time, and the food banks that are supposed to fill the gap are already overwhelmed. Feeding America documented that over 50 million Americans turned to food banks and pantries for help. Food bank networks across the country have reported that demand has risen dramatically since the government shutdown cut SNAP benefits in at least 25 states. The Capital Area Food Bank found that 36% of households in the greater Washington, D.C. region experienced food insecurity in 2024. The Greater Boston Food Bank found 37% in Massachusetts. Both numbers were higher than the national average. And these are not rural areas without infrastructure. These are some of the wealthiest metropolitan regions in the country. If food insecurity in Boston and Washington is running at 36 to 37%, the numbers in rural Appalachia, in the Mississippi Delta, in the Rio Grande Valley, in Native American reservations are dramatically worse. And the infrastructure to measure those numbers is being dismantled at the federal level, while the infrastructure to feed those communities is being defunded at the programmatic level. The government shutdown already proved that SNAP can be turned off overnight, and 40 million Americans have no backup plan. The government shutdown that began on October 1, 2025, provided a live preview of what happens when SNAP distribution is interrupted. At least 25 states announced that SNAP benefits would not be paid in November if the shutdown continued. The Trump administration declined to use $6 billion in USDA reserve funds to maintain SNAP payments. For the 40 million Americans who depend on SNAP, the shutdown revealed a vulnerability that most had never considered. SNAP benefits are funded through the annual appropriations process. When the government shuts down, the legal authority to distribute those benefits can lapse. There is no automatic trigger that keeps SNAP payments flowing during a shutdown. There is no strategic food reserve analogous to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. There is no emergency stockpile of groceries maintained by the federal government for distribution during a funding disruption. The system depends entirely on continuous congressional funding, and when that funding is interrupted, 40 million people discover simultaneously that their food supply is contingent on the ability of 535 members of Congress to pass a bill. And the shutdown demonstrated something else that is rarely discussed. The communities that depend most on SNAP are the least equipped to absorb a sudden loss of food purchasing power. Rural communities where the nearest grocery store is 30 miles away and the nearest food bank is 50 miles away cannot be served by emergency distribution programs that are designed for urban density. Elderly Americans who cannot drive to a food bank and who do not have family members nearby to help them are invisible to the emergency food system until they show up at an emergency room with malnutrition-related complications. And children in households where SNAP is the primary source of food dollars do not experience a benefit delay as an administrative inconvenience. They experience it as an empty refrigerator. Detroit, Michigan, where CNBC photographed people waiting in line to pick up groceries from the anti-hunger nonprofit Forgotten Harvest in November 2025, provided the visual evidence of what the shutdown meant at the household level, lines that stretched around buildings. Families who had never used a food bank before standing alongside families who had been using them for years. The demand surge was so severe that some food banks ran out of supply before they ran out of people in line, and that was a temporary disruption caused by a shutdown that eventually ended. The SNAP cuts in the OBBBA are permanent. The $295 billion reduction is not a temporary pause. It is a structural redesign of the program that will permanently reduce the amount of food that 40 million Americans can afford to buy for the rest of their lives, or until Congress reverses the cuts, which the current political dynamics make extremely unlikely within the next 2 to 4 years. Rural America is already in a food desert, and the summer will turn those deserts into famines of access. Food insecurity data consistently shows that urban and rural households experience higher rates of food insecurity than suburban households. In 2024, urban food insecurity was 16% and rural food insecurity was 15.9%, both substantially higher than the suburban rate of 11.9%. But the nature of rural food insecurity is qualitatively different from urban food insecurity in ways that make it harder to solve with the tools that currently exist. In rural America, the issue is not just affordability, it is physical access. The USDA defines a food desert as a low-income area where a significant share of residents lives more than 10 miles from the nearest supermarket. Millions of rural Americans live in food deserts where the closest source of fresh produce is a 20 or 30-minute drive each way, requiring a vehicle, fuel time, and the physical ability to make the trip. For elderly rural Americans on fixed incomes, many of whom no longer drive, the nearest source of fresh food might as well be on another continent. They depend on whatever is available at the gas station, convenience store, or the dollar store, neither of which offers the nutritional variety needed to manage the chronic conditions that are most prevalent in exactly this population: diabetes, hypertension, heart disease. And rural food banks, unlike their urban counterparts, cover enormous geographic territories with limited infrastructure, limited volunteer bases, and limited refrigeration capacity. A food bank serving a 3-county rural area in Appalachia or the Great Plains cannot achieve the distribution density of a food bank serving a single borough in New York City. The per-meal cost of delivery in rural areas is dramatically higher. The efficiency is dramatically lower, and the summer, when temperatures make refrigerated transport more expensive and food spoilage more frequent, is when the logistics of rural food distribution become most challenging. The families who are most food insecure in rural America are the families who are hardest to reach, hardest to serve, and hardest to count. And the elimination of the USDA Food Security Report ensures that their hunger will not be counted at all, because the survey that reached 60,000 households monthly, including rural households that no other data collection effort reaches, is being discontinued. The most vulnerable population in the most underserved geography is losing the only measurement that documented their existence. At the same time, they are losing the benefits that kept them fed. And nobody in Washington is connecting those two facts, because connecting them would require admitting that the policy is producing the outcome it was designed to produce, which is reducing the federal cost of feeding poor people by making poor people invisible to the federal government. 40% of families in New York City cannot afford their weekly food costs, according to data from Robin Hood and Columbia University. 37% in Massachusetts, 36% in Washington, D.C. These numbers are from some of the highest income metropolitan regions in the country. Imagine what the corresponding numbers are in counties where the median household income is $35,000, where the nearest hospital is 45 minutes away, where the factory that employed half the town closed in 2019, where the grocery store that served the community for 40 years closed in 2023 because the margins on rural grocery are too thin to sustain a business when transportation costs rise and population declines. Those communities exist in every state. They are not hypothetical. They are the towns where food insecurity is not 14%. It is 25 or 30 or 40%. And the people living in those communities are watching the same cable news broadcast that tell them the economy is strong, the stock market is up, and the inflation rate is 2.4%. And they are sitting at kitchen tables doing math that does not work. Social Security of $1,400. Rent of $750. Electricity of $180. Insurance on the truck of $200. Gas of $160. Medications of $120. That is $1,410 in fixed costs, leaving minus $10 for food for the entire month before they have bought a single grocery. And the SNAP benefit that used to close that gap is being reduced by $100 per month. And the food bank that was supposed to catch the people who fall through the SNAP gap ran out of supply during the shutdown and is not fully restocked. And the school that was feeding their grandchildren lunch 5 days a week just closed for the summer. And the USDA report that would have counted them as food insecure next year has been eliminated. They are hungry, they are invisible, and they are everywhere. Share this video with every American you know who eats food, because the system that puts food on the American table is being structurally dismantled at the federal level, while the costs of food are being driven upward by a war, an energy crisis, a fertilizer shortage, and an inflation cascade that has not finished arriving. Subscribe and turn on notifications. No spin, no party line, just the numbers. Take care of yourselves out there. And if you know someone who is food insecure, who is elderly and alone, who is a single mother stretching a SNAP budget that just got $100 smaller, who is a grandparent raising grandchildren on a fixed income that does not cover food and medicine in the same month, do not wait for the government to help them. The government is cutting the help. Do not wait for the food bank to reach them. The food bank may be out of supply. Reach them yourself. Because the system that was supposed to prevent hunger in the richest country on earth has been deliberately weakened at the exact moment that every force driving hunger, war, energy costs, fertilizer prices, inflation, and benefit cuts is simultaneously intensifying. The safety net has holes in it, and the people who are falling through those holes are not falling into another program. They are falling into hunger. In America, in 2026. And most of them are invisible to everyone except the people who live next door to them.